Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History Experience. Today, I'm excited to welcome Vladimir Alexandrov. He is an author and a historian. Today, we will discuss his latest book, To Break Russia's Chains, Boris Savinkov and His War Against the Tsar and the Bolsheviks. Therefore, I welcome you, Vladimir, and I invite you to share your presentation.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be able to say a few words about my book. So it's a biography. My book is a biography of a remarkable man, a cradle-to-grave biography as it's described. I trace his entire life, but of course focus on the most eventful aspects of it. And I was drawn to Boris Savinkov initially because he led a remarkable life that has fallen through the cracks of history for reasons that we could perhaps talk about later. Perhaps a good way to characterize his significance is to quote what Winston Churchill said about him. Churchill knew him well and valued him. And for a period in his life, Savinkov was an important unofficial advisor to Churchill on the Soviet Union and on Russian matters in general. So Churchill said in a memoir that he included in his book of essays, Great Contemporaries, that Savinkov was one of these people about whom one could say, few men tried more, gave more, dared more, and suffered more for the Russian people. So Savinkov is largely forgotten in the West now. He remains a legendary figure in Russia, but during his life, at the end of the 19th century, and especially in the beginning of the 20th, he was famous and notorious both at home and abroad. And since this period bridges the time of the end of the Russian Empire and the beginning of the Soviet period, it's a particularly important one for not just Russian, but European history. And Savinkov's character is fascinating. That's something that brought me to him. It wasn't just his political role, which was significant as well. He was a conflicted and contradictory character. He was, for example, a paradoxically moral revolutionary terrorist, and I can describe what that means. It sounds like an oxymoron. But he was a moral revolutionary terrorist. He was also a scandalous novelist. There were people who were terrified of him, but he was capable of reciting romantic poetry for hours at the same time. He was a professional revolutionary, but he became friends with epoch-defining artists like Diego Rivera and Modigliani in Paris during the Great War. He spent a lot of time running from the Imperial Russian police, but in the revolutionary year 1917, he became a government minister in the provisional government that Russia had between the two revolutions. I mentioned that he was an advisor to Churchill. He was a close friend of the first leader of an independent Poland. Poland, as you know, was partitioned at the end of the 18th century among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and ceased to exist as a separate country for over 120 years until the Russian Revolution came. The Poles declared their freedom in 1918, and the first leader of Poland, Josip Pilsudski, invited Savinkov, I was thinking of another book, to come to Poland and raise an army, a private Russian army to help fight the Bolsheviks, another remarkable thing that Savinkov did. And after 1917, even starting before the coup d'etat that the Bolsheviks carried out in November of 1917, Savinkov was an implacable foe of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. He fought them tooth and nail till the end of his life in 1925. In what ways? He raised the private army in central Russia when the white generals didn't want him to be involved in their affairs because they didn't like his overly liberal politics. He tried to get the British and the French to invade the early Soviet Union. When that didn't work, he organized private espionage and sabotage activities on Soviet territory, which he ran from Poland and from Paris. And at the very end of his life, as I argue in my book, he, I believe, conspired to be captured by the Soviet secret police, expecting that this would probably happen to him if he crossed the border into Soviet Russia illegally, because he thought that he would be able to deceive the Soviet secret police, be released, and carry out one final blow against the tyrannical regime. So this is just a very brief overview of what the book is about. Savinkov's life could be characterized as epic in the old sense of the term, by which I mean that this is an individual who lived through the defining experiences and periods of his entire people. His life runs like a red thread through late Imperial Russian and early Soviet history, and he deserves to be recognized for that. The book is on the long side. To make it easier to read, I tried to write it like a novel, but I also have to say that I was inspired to do this by the fact that when I was researching Savinkov's life, it read like a novel. It reads like a thriller. So if I had simply told someone I was thinking of writing a book about a man, and then I started to list all the things that I would include in it, all the things that are based on Savinkov's life, it's likely that a potential reader would say, oh, that sounds too fantastic. Well, in this case, there's a man who actually lived up to that. So that's briefly a characterization of the book.
Thank you. What were the factors that led Boris Savinkov to become a revolutionary?
It began with the Polish theme in his life. He was raised in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, which was, as I said, part of the Russian Empire. His parents were Russian. His father worked as a judge in the judicial system that the Russian Empire administered in occupied Poland. And his parents raised him in a very liberal atmosphere. I'll give you one concrete example. In the later part of the 19th century, the Russian Imperial regime tried to suppress the use of Polish in schools. Savinkov's parents wanted him to learn the language of the people where he lived. Around 1897, the Russian Imperial regime decided to put up a monument in Vilnius, which was then in occupied Poland, commemorating the activities of a Russian politician who suppressed one of the Polish uprisings against Russian rule, the one in 1863. By this point, Savinkov was a student of law in St. Petersburg University in Russia. And he and other students became incensed at the idea that a monument would be put up to somebody that the Poles reviled. They called him the hangman of Vilnius. But from the Russian imperial perspective, he was a patriot who helped suppress an illegitimate rebellion by Poles. So Savinkov became involved in a letter writing campaign in which he protested, together with other students, against the fact that certain sycophantic professors in Warsaw University wrote letters of support of this monument. Well, this doesn't seem to be that big of a transgression, but in the atmosphere of the time, the issue of Poland was fraught for the Russian imperial regime, and Savinkov was arrested briefly for this infraction and letters were seized. This, of course, incensed him. It was highly unjust. When he went back to St. Petersburg, he became involved in student protests against such things as the antiquated academic curriculum that was being used in the Russian imperial university system. The imperial regime treated such outbursts of student rebellion very harshly. And you can imagine what the consequence was. The students escalated, began to protest social injustices, which were widespread in the Russian Empire. The regime cracked down on them even harder. Students were even threatened, and actually they were not just threatened, they were punished by being drafted into the army. And SAVINKOV was expelled from the university for his political activities and forbidden from studying in any other Russian university, as a result of which he went to Germany and then France, didn't take the opportunities to study there very seriously, became more and more radicalized. And when he came back to Russia, he decided that he was going to be a professional revolutionary because student concerns were too minor in comparison to the social injustices, political injustices that he saw as being dominant in the Russian Empire. And it's worth mentioning here that although some people, many people in the West now think, because of the way history developed, that it was the Marxist Bolsheviks who were the dominant radical revolutionary force in Imperial Russia. Well, not in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, at least. It was the Socialist Revolutionary Party that was the most popular and the most influential. That was the party that focused primarily, initially, on the needs of the Russian peasantry. And 80% of the Russian imperial population were peasants. The Bolsheviks were Marxists, and following Marx, of course, they initially tried to focus on the industrial proletariat. But that was a kind of a bad fit for Russia because industry was relatively undeveloped in comparison to Western Europe or the United States. In Russia, there weren't as many workers as would have been necessary for a Marxist application of ideology to Russia. There were other issues as well. There's also, it's not just the idea of social injustice that bothered SAVINKOV, although he embraced the Socialist Revolutionary Platform fully. Maybe I should say briefly what it is. They were for a democratic republic. They wanted universal suffrage. And very importantly, they wanted self-determination for all of the peoples who had been subjects of the Russian imperial system. That means the Poles, the Finns, the Estonians, the Latvians, Lithuanians, the Ukrainians. SAVINKOV later in his life even became a partisan of the idea that various Caucasian peoples should be allowed to choose their own historical path and have their own country. So it was a very liberal political view in that sense. They were socialists, which meant that they believed that the peasants who worked the land needed to have control over that land, and that the workers who labored in factories needed to be able to control those factories and not simply be the employees of somebody who made a lot of money off of their efforts. The Socialist Revolutionaries, as I said, were not Marxists. They did not believe in class warfare. SAVINKOV was born into the minor Russian nobility, which didn't give him any kind of special financial advantage, but gave him a kind of an estate status in the imperial system. The Socialist Revolutionaries didn't care about the origin of their members. They were not class focused. For the Marxist Bolsheviks, one's socioeconomic class, as you know, was almost as indelible as race is for racists of the sort that we have in the United States, for example. So the other aspect of the Socialist Revolutionary Program that appealed to SAVINKOV greatly was a result of his having a romantic streak in his personality. One of the tactics that the Socialist Revolutionaries were most famous and notorious for was something they called central terror. They targeted with surgical precision leading figures in the imperial regime and assassinated them. The purpose of this, they believed, was to catalyze a popular uprising. And this idea appealed to SAVINKOV greatly from the start, of being a member of a small, heroic group of individuals who were prepared to risk their lives and give their lives in a spectacular act of assassination in order to free the Russian people. So that's a little bit about him and his involvement in revolutionary activity. It's interesting that there was no training program that the Socialist Revolutionaries had for people like him. When he was admitted into the combat organization, he was basically told by the leader what to do, which was to enter the Russian Empire illegally, smuggling in dynamite and money, for example, and then to figure out, with very little advice, how he would be able, with a team, a small team of other individuals, to assassinate a senior Russian imperial minister. At any rate, he learned on the job, as it were, and was very successful in organizing probably the two most spectacular assassinations, one in 1904 of the Russian Minister of the Interior, von Plehve, and then in 1905, even more spectacularly, Grand Duke Sergei, the uncle of the reigning Russian Emperor Nicholas II, a brother of Alexander III, the previous Tsar to Nicholas II. And SAVINKOV organized the attempt, which succeeded, as a result of which Sergei was literally blown to pieces inside the Kremlin. And then there's much more to say about him, but our time is limited.
In the book you write about Boris SAVINKOV, that he was a cunning conspirator, but fell victim to the greatest deception in the annals of Russian political skullduggery. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes, this would also allow me to say a few words about this seemingly oxymoronic formulation that I've used of his being a moral terrorist. Let me just say a few words about that, and then I'll move from that to the specific matter you raise, because they're connected. So the Socialist Revolutionaries believe that killing leading figures would help advance the movement toward a popular uprising, a popular revolution. But one enormous difference between them and the terrorists we unfortunately know today is the surgical precision of the efforts by the Socialist Revolutionaries. They made every possible effort not to harm innocents. Nowadays, as we know, terrorists rarely, if ever, try to target either the generals or the politicians who are supposedly responsible for the problems that the terrorists are trying to combat. Terrorists will kill as many people pursuing any kind of activity anywhere they can without there having any kind of direct causal relationship to the problems that the terrorists are concerned with. Let me briefly describe how this worked in practice. So in 1905, SAVINKOV and his team targeted Grand Duke Sergei, whom they successfully killed in the Kremlin, which incidentally helped contribute to the pressure on Nicholas II to introduce reforms. So one could argue that this assassination, with other things that were going on in Russia at the time, played the role that the revolutionaries wanted. SAVINKOV and his team killed Sergei on the second attempt. The first attempt was several days before. And what happened was that the Grand Duke was on his way in his carriage to the Bolshoi Theater in the center of Moscow for a special performance. And the assassin was waiting for him near the historical museum, which is on the edge of Red Square in Moscow, with a bomb. Seeing the Grand Duke's carriage, the assassin, or the assassin wannabe, a man by the name of Ivan Kalyaev, picked up his arm with the bomb in it, which weighed several kilograms, ran toward the carriage, got close enough to be able to look inside the carriage, and stopped as abruptly as if he had hit a wall. Why? Because he saw the Grand Duke in the carriage, but he also saw a woman sitting next to him, and across from them, 2 children. And he couldn't bring himself to blow them up because the target was just Sergei. Savinkov was nearby in a garden that's still in Moscow by the Kremlin wall. Kalyaev went to consult with him, and Savinkov said in response to Kalyaev's question, "No, you were right. It's immoral to kill innocents." Now, what happened was that, fortunately, or in quotation marks, fortunately for Kalyaev, I want to make it clear that I'm not defending even this kind of terrorism. I'm simply describing it. There were no guards, either in the carriage, on the carriage, or behind the carriage. The coachman didn't see the man who ran up to the coach, and none of the people inside saw what happened either. But by stopping the attack, Kalyaev risked getting caught had somebody been there. And as a terrorist, both he and the entire team would have been executed. So he basically was risking death to uphold the moral principle of not killing innocent people. And so Savinkov approved his decision to stop the attack. As I said, 2 days later, it succeeded. The other aspect of the morality of these Russian terrorists is that they agonized over what they did. Kalyaev regretted, on some level, the fact that he had taken another life, even though it was for the common good. Savinkov also knew that experience and never quite got over the fact that he had killed. Kalyaev, for example, and several of the other terrorists who worked with Savinkov, was a deeply religious person. He thought that in some sense, he was trying to imitate Christ's sacrifice of his life for humankind. But of course, Kalyaev and the others understood that Christ did not kill, and they did. So they thought that their death during a terrorist attack from the explosion or from being shot by the police, or their execution if they were captured, was justified. It was punishment for the sin of murder that they had committed. So this is a kind of a moral psychological profile of Savinkov and his colleagues. Now it turns out, and here I get to the question that you asked, that he was a very skillful conspirator, but fell victim to the greatest example of skullduggery in the annals of Russian terrorism and spying. Savinkov became second in command of the combat organization, this terrorist arm of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. The head of the combat organization was a man by the name of Yevno Azev. And he, it turns out, during all this time, was a traitor. He was the leader of the most violent branch of the SR party, and at the same time, he had been on the payroll of the Russian Imperial Police, the Akhrana, for over a decade. But he wasn't simply a double agent, because he allowed some terrorist acts to go forward, like the ones that I described. But then he sabotaged others. For example, when Savinkov was leaving Russia after the assassination of Sergei, it subsequently emerged that Azev, the head of the organization, tried to give him up to the Imperial Police. And it was only luck that allowed Savinkov to escape, because he decided to cross the border into Poland or into Germany at another location than the one Azev knew about. It's to this day not entirely clear what motivated Azev to allow some assassinations to happen and to thwart others. He also at another point in Savinkov's life, successfully gave Savinkov up to the police in Odessa. But Savinkov, in a complicated way, was able to escape being hanged because he was able to get out of prison. So what we have here is a completely immoral individual doing what he was doing for his own benefit and interests. Azef made a great deal of money because the Imperial police paid him and the terrorists or the SRs paid him. And he was able to maneuver in between the SRs and the Imperial police by lying to them both. So that, for example, when questioned, how is it that you're the head of the combat organization and Savinkov's team kills the Grand Duke in Moscow? How is it that you allowed this to happen? Azef's response would be, I was in Paris at the time, I wasn't in control. So he managed to maneuver in between these two forces. This gave him an advantage in dealing with violent political historical events that Savinkov did not have, because Savinkov was always a principled man. It may sound that he was some kind of a monster, as if he was a monster because he was willing to kill senior political figures for political reasons. But he always, in his own mind, and together with the like-minded revolutionaries who were in his teams, rationalized it. We are executing Grand Duke Sergei because of the various ills that he's responsible for. And they would have a long catalog of reasons why he deserved to die. The SRs also, incidentally, believed that terrorism was justified only because there was no other system to change anything in Russia. Had there been free elections, they would have suspended terrorist activities. And when the first Russian parliament was announced in 1905, the Duma, the SR leaders did suspend terrorism, wanting to see whether or not the institution of even a feeble form of democracy would take root. And if it did, then it becomes immoral to kill to make political change. Now, this had nothing to do with the way in which Azef operated. And when various bits of evidence began to reach the leaders of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, including Savinkov, who was one of the senior members at this point, people would say, you know, this Azef is acting in a way that's very suspicious. He knows things that only the Imperial secret police could have known. We have to investigate him. They refused to take those accusations seriously because that was an attempt to impugn the honor of a member of their group. A famous old revolutionary in Russian history by the name of Vera Figner, of an older generation than Savinkov's, characterized this very cleverly and accurately. She said, using the Russian phrase, which I'll translate, "Они глупо честны." They are stupidly honest, the SRs and the members of the combat organization. They couldn't imagine that somebody could be as harmful and duplicitous as Azef was because they were not themselves. So it took a long time, and the efforts of a particularly zealous investigative journalist and investigator by the name of Vladimir Burtsev, who accumulated evidence from all kinds of sources about the fact that Azef was actually a traitor to the combat organization and responsible for the deaths of numerous and imprisonment of numerous revolutionaries. Before the Central Committee of the SR party, Socialist Revolutionaries, abridged as SR, finally decided to investigate the matter. It's interesting that in his memoirs, Savinkov has a transcript of the trial that the SR Central Committee carried out to assess whether or not Azef was guilty. Savinkov was a member of the group of, what shall we call them, judges who were trying to decide the matter. And he refused again and again to believe that Azev, who was apparently he felt was a close comrade in arms, could be capable of this. He said, no, these accusations are invented by the Imperial police to throw discord into our revolutionary ranks. Well, eventually the evidence was so incontrovertible that even SAVINKOV had to admit to what was true. And it was a devastating thing for him to recognize. So that's how it was that a figure in this period and late Imperial Russian period, Azev, who is as lurid, if not more lurid, than Rasputin, who is more notorious, was finally shown to be for what he is, ironically, because of the same kind of belief in the importance of honor, honesty, and due process. SAVINKOV and his fellows inadvertently allowed Azev to escape. They did not act ruthlessly enough to kill him, which is what they decided he deserved. And Azev escaped. He wound up dying for completely unrelated reasons after living happily on all of his ill-gotten gains for quite a number of years. And the same trait of this kind of honesty, belief in process, belief in loyalty, is also why SAVINKOV was not able to turn Russian history in a different direction when he was the acting Minister of War in the Kerensky provisional government in 1917. There was a moment, it's complicated, I'm not going to go into it in detail. I talk about it in detail in my book, when the commander-in-chief of the Russian armies, which were doing very poorly against the Germans and the Austrians by this point, when General Kornilov and SAVINKOV could have taken power and reversed the drift of the provisional government toward increasing chaos, which is what allowed the Bolsheviks to carry out their coup d'etat. But because SAVINKOV had sworn allegiance to the provisional government and was an official figure in it, as officially acting Minister of War, the Prime Minister was also the Minister of War, he couldn't bring himself to break his oath. As a result of which he betrayed a man, General Kornilov, whom he admired above all others. He did it because he believed the principle of due process was inviolate. So this is some more of why digging into his character is so fascinating, because his character winds up being not only his destiny, but affecting the destiny of his country.
Thank you. When do you think was the high point for Boris Savinkov's career?
Oh, I think there are probably several. Surely when he was still trying to work as a terrorist, the campaigns against the Minister of the Interior, who was a reviled figure in liberal circles, and the campaign against Grand Duke Sergei, who was hated not just by the revolutionaries, but lots of liberals reviled him as well for various reasons. He was able to pull off assassinations that actually did shake the foundations of the Russian Empire. I repeat, there were other things going on. In 1905, for example, there was a revolution in Russia, in part triggered by the disastrous progress of the Russo-Japanese War, which the Russians entered thinking they would win easily, and in which they were badly beaten. But that's certainly one of the high points. I think also the fact that when he was in exile, he wrote a novel, The Pale Horse, which won him a permanent, but I have to add, small place in the history of Russian literature. It was a novel that was scandalous because people thought it was his honest description of his own life as a terrorist. What it is, however, is that it's based on his experiences, but it also departs from his experiences in many ways. But since it's written in the first person, lots of readers assume that it's Savinkov speaking in his own person, although even the book was published under a pseudonym. He wrote the novel in part under the tutelage of the most important power couple in Russian literature of that period. The novelist Dmitry Merezhkovsky and the poet Zinaida Gippius, who were very close friends and confidants of his. So that was not a mean achievement. Of course, speaking objectively in the context of Russian literature of the time, my view is that the novel is quite weak as a work of art. It tries to be impressive, and to me it seems to be merely maudlin. But that's not the most important thing about it. It's very revealing about aspects of Savinkov's psychology, and it certainly created waves, as a result of which he started to become, let's put it that way, not just notorious or famous, depending on whether you were for the revolution or against it. He was also becoming a legendary figure in his own life. I think another high point, because you can't forget about it, is what I mentioned just earlier when he was the acting minister of war. He was dedicated, despite the fact that he was a revolutionary, he was dedicated to Russia winning against the Germans and the Austrians, because he believed that what they would impose on Russia would be worse than the imperial system. So he argued for suspending revolutionary activity and putting all energy into winning the war against the enemy. And he tried to do what he could to reverse the deterioration of the collapse of the Russian army. I talked about why he failed because of his principles, but that's also a noteworthy thing. I think the fact that he became an advisor to Winston Churchill in 1919 and 1922, Churchill agreed with him so much that there are documents I found in the British archives in London where Churchill was a member of the British cabinet at the time, pretty much summarizes Savinkov's views on the Soviet Union. And Churchill distributes these to the other members of the cabinet as the wisest view that exists currently on the Russian situation. I mean, Savinkov traveled to London when David Lloyd George was the prime minister. Churchill took Savinkov to Chequers, which was recently become the country house for the prime minister to use, so that Savinkov could talk to the prime minister directly. So that's another peak in his life. Another high point is a kind of ironic one, and this will be the last one I'll mention. It's too complicated to go into here. Moreover, I want people who listen to this to become perhaps intrigued enough to want to read the book. So I'll simply say that Savinkov developed an elaborate plot at the end of his life. I've alluded to it already, as a result of which he made a public announcement when he was in Moscow and in prison that he accepted the Soviet regime. This got him international attention because what he had been known for prior to this was his violent opposition to the Bolsheviks. Many people took what he said seriously and saw him as worse than Judas in terms of betraying his own principles. But if you want to consider a negative high point, that certainly was one. So that array will have to be the sum of his high points.
Thank you. How is Boris Savinkov seen in contemporary day Russia?
It's changing. He lost his war against the Soviets. in 1925 when he died. But he was a very serious opponent. So the Soviets tried to capitalize on their victory over him at the same time that they diminished him as a political and revolutionary figure. They tried to describe him as more of an adventurer, but still a very colorful one. The whole role of the Socialist Revolutionary Party is one that Soviet historiographers have suppressed. They want people to think that there was the bad imperial system, and then Lenin came, overthrew the emperor, and took over. The complications that ensued between the fall of the Romanov dynasty and the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks, those are things that are not, featured prominently in popular Soviet-era histories of this period in Russian history. More recently, things have changed. There's a small number of very serious and very good historians who have started mining the archives, and there are just countless files of papers pertaining to SAVINKOV in archives that are open to researchers and in archives that are not open to researchers, like the FSB, formerly KGB, formerly NKVD, formerly GPU archives, which started collecting materials on SAVINKOV very early on after the CHK, the first version of the Soviet secret police, was founded in 1918 by Felix Dzerzhinsky. So these serious historians have been working in the archives that they could get access to, and they are producing a reevaluation of SAVINKOV as not just a colorful figure, but as an important political one as well, despite the fact that he failed in his various efforts. So that's on the official side. On the unofficial side, there's always been a fascination with SAVINKOV in Russia. During the Soviet period, there were novels and movies made about him where predictably he was cast in a negative light, but still he was a significant opponent. This continued after the fall of the Soviet Union. Nowadays, if you enter Boris Savinkov, Revolutionnaire, Boris Savinkov, a revolutionary, in Cyrillic into the main Russian search engine Yandex, you'll get millions of hits. And there are countless people with varying degrees of sympathy and antipathy towards Savinkov, because he's not a simple character, and there are lots of people who dislike him. There are lots of people who are fascinated by him. You don't find very many who are very favorable about him. Moreover, these people know varying amounts of information about him. A lot of it is repeated from one source to another without any kind of real basis, but there's a lot of talk about him. He continues to fascinate. I might mention that my biography in English is the first one to appear in the West in something like 30 years. There is a biography being prepared. It may even have been published by one of the Russian historians in Moscow. I'm not sure what the status of that is. So he's a figure of interest. He's a figure that is sort of legendary in Russian sort of popular historical conceptions. But as I said, in the West, he's almost unknown except to specialists, and even then, only partially.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book?
Oh, it's easy to get. If you have access to any of the Amazon portals, whether it's in the UK or in the US, or I think there's even an Amazon in various European countries, it's available there. I've seen it announced in online booksellers in various European countries. So that's probably the easiest way to do it. The book was published in New York and in London. So I imagine that anybody in Europe who's interested, I gather you're in Ireland, right?
Yes.
Can get it from whatever UK booksellers one normally turns to.
Thank you, Vladimir, very much for joining us today, and I wish you great success with your book.
Thanks very much. It was fun talking about it. Take care.
And I would like to thank you, the viewers, very much for watching this interview. See you this Friday, where I will talk with historian Andrew Roberts about his latest book about British King George III.